Do you think that Michael Scott from The Office is a bad boss?
Yes. I don't think he's
that bad.
He's one of the worst bosses.
I feel like he's one of the best bosses.
He is. If you think about radical candor, the axes, he like cares deeply but will not challenge.
Yeah. They made an entire show about his hijinks and everyone loved it. So
I guess if you wanted to waste 8 hours of your day and not get anywhere, fantastic.
What do you think I'm doing at Morning Brew?
Yeah.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Per My Last Email, the show where we give you the hot takes and tactics necessary to navigate work life. My name is Kyle Hagee, one of the co-hosts.
I'm Kaila Lopez, the other co-host.
And that's it. We have two co-hosts.
There's no one else.
There's no third co-host. Dynamic duo here. What are we going to talk about today, Kayla?
Well, before we talk about what we're going to talk about today, I have a call out, a CTA, if you will.
Listen in, folks. We have a very special announcement for you.
Well, it's not that special, so let's not make it that crazy. We want to hear from you. Okay, we've had, 14 episodes, 15 episodes. Mm-hmm. We are getting a lot of really incredible feedback, but only via text. We want to listen to your voices.
Yes.
So please send us a voice memo. It can be feedback. It can be a question. It can be a scenario that you want our advice on. It can, be something about your family. I don't care.
Talk to us about your grocery list. Literally
send
anything,
us
folks.
Voice memos, voice notes to permylastemail@morningbrew.com or send it to us on Instagram. Send it to us on Twitter. We don't care. We're available.
Yes.
And we want to hear from you. Now, on to the show. So we're going to talk about when to break up with your boss.
Yes.
The sensitive subject.
Dealing with bad bosses. I've been very fortunate with bosses throughout my career. What about you?
I think I've had very good. I've had the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
I've had very good bosses, and I've had bosses that were less
You've
great.
watched the movie Horrible Bosses, and you've had great bosses yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. Just watched the movie, never experienced it myself. But let's set the scene a little bit. Like, does having a bad boss even matter?
Right.
What's the data behind that?
Yeah, so let's look at a few stats. Again, I think this is a really important topic, and I think the stats back us up. So Gallup had a poll where they showed that 70% of variance in employee engagement scores are due to a manager. So of all the different variances that can happen for an employee engagement score, 70% of them were directly related to who your manager is and how they interacted with you.
Which makes sense, yeah.
Which makes sense. The same poll showed that half of employees have quit a job because of the relationship with their manager. So it's a constant source of frustration.
That actually feels low.
And yeah, maybe it does feel low, but it's showing like your relationship with your boss is important, at least. And for some people, it's causing them to leave their existing job. And then McKinsey had a report that said 75% of the most stressful experiences at work were due to the relationship with your boss, which again, I don't think that is ever going to change. I think what that really is highlighting is it's the person you're spending a lot of time with.
Right.
They're directly their influence is directly correlated to how you might grow in your career. So of course, if it's not going well, it's going to feel very stressful. And so all of these stats to show like the importance of the relationship you have with your manager.
Yeah. I completely understand all of those things.
Yeah.
I do think it makes sense that your boss is one of the most stressful parts of your job because that's the person who has the most influence on your outcome.
Exactly.
So that's huge. Another stat that we saw was that it can take up to 22 months to recover physically and emotionally, although I don't really know what physically means in that situation.
Yeah, what's going on there?
We got to look into that stat. From a bad boss. So almost 2 years before you're like free from the trauma of a bad boss, which sounds dramatic, but I actually believe it. I mean, I think having somebody that has so much control over 8 hours plus of your day that is using it incorrectly or that is causing you undue stress, like that's very tough on you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in like how they came to this number and like the research method they used. Like
every day they're like, are you cool now?
Have you recovered mentally from that terrible experience you had? But I think the broader point is if you have a very bad boss, it actually can really affect you. And I have a friend going through that now, and like we hung out and he was like, I haven't really been seeing people for like the past month.
That's horrible.
Because every day for 8 hours, I'm so stressed because my boss is so toxic. And so if you have a very bad situation, it can affect you outside of work as well, which I think once you're getting into that area, you got to find a way out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there was another stat that was talking about what toxic means or like how it's like 50% of people consider their bosses to be mildly or highly toxic.
That seems so high.
Which seems really high. And I think it's worth, before we go into like when to break up with your boss and like talking about all these scenarios in which bosses can be really horrible, I think it's worth talking about like, what does toxic actually mean for a boss? Like, I had a boss that when I was first starting my internship, like my first 3 weeks, was really, really hard on me.
Yeah.
And she, like, to the point of tears. Granted, I was, 20 years old and I couldn't really like handle emotional distress.
You hadn't developed the emotional capacities fully yet.
The prefrontal cortex was still cooking. And she was really, really hard on me. And I remember 2 weeks into like my 3-week rotation with her, she sat me down and was like, I'm not going to hire you, because the way that it works is you spend 3 weeks with a desk and then, at the end, they either give you an offer or they don't. And she said, I'm not going to hire you, but I think you're fantastic. And I think you have high potential, which is why I've been pushing you so much. But I just don't think you're a good fit for this desk, which was equity derivatives. I would have hated it. I'm so glad.
I look at you and I'm like, that's not an equity derivatives person.
No, exactly. Equity derivative sales, it was not my thing.
I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, it's fine. We'll talk about it later. And she made me cry, but it was so helpful because she was like, you're meek. You downplay everything that you say. You say, oh, I've never seen this before. Just take it in, react. Don't downplay your accomplishments or your intelligence.
Yeah.
And she connected me with 3 other people that I ended up working for and I'm still friends with to this day.
Yeah, to me, toxic is like a serious term.
Yeah.
That should be used for like serious like injustices.
Yeah.
Or like we'll talk about it later, but like things you need to go to HR for or like get out immediately. I think we've probably watered down this term. Like people are like, oh, my boss told me what to do. They're so toxic. That's the definition of a boss.
That's what they're paid to do.
Yeah. and I think in your scenario that you just illuminated, what I think is interesting is sometimes like the best teachers, it's kind of like uncomfortable in the moment. They're pushing you. You don't want to hear what they have to say in that moment. But upon reflection, you're like, I'm really glad they did that.
Yeah.
They almost showed me what is possible and they pushed me harder and further than I would have pushed myself. And I think you come to really appreciate those experiences.
Yeah.
So there's this gap between what you're experiencing in the moment and what you might actually be grateful for down the line.
Yeah. And I mean, this was a decade ago, so I don't remember what I called her, but I probably would have considered that she was toxic in that moment.
Exactly.
But the next 2 months of my experience, if she hadn't sat me down and been so strict with me, I probably wouldn't have evolved at all. I would have continued doing those things that were discounting my relationships and my intelligence.
And I want to talk about this more later, but just to bring it up now too, your mindset around your boss is also very important. There's a scenario where she could have told you exactly what she told you and you just bailed. You were like, I don't want to hear this. You're so toxic. You're mean. I quit. But instead you had enough self-awareness to be like, maybe I do need to hear this. And maybe I am going to learn from this experience. And before we get into the scenarios, this reminded me of something that Chuck told me. Like one of the first things he ever told me was before he was CEO, was at a meeting with the CEO and other senior leaders at the company at the time. And they passed around this sheet of paper. And on the sheet of paper was an email that Chuck had written. I think he was like running the marketing division at this point. And every single piece of paper had this big red circle around it. And it was a spelling mistake on the email.
No.
And the current CEO at the time goes, so what do you guys think is wrong with this email? And Chuck is like so embarrassed.
That's not the right way to do it, though.
And Chuck is so embarrassed. And some people are like, yeah, there's a spelling mistake. And he's like, the CEO has basically said, if we can't even spell right, how do you think we're going to build a business?
Jeez.
And he was like, God. Yeah, literally. Like, I mean, this is a little old school, but all the personalities in the room, like it kind of made sense to do this. And Chuck said, he was like, I remember right away being pissed, so embarrassed. Yeah. And then I reflected on it for a day and I was like, he is pointing out my mistakes, and like he is only doing this because he has faith that I can like grow. And maybe that's like a bit of an egregious example.
That's that's toxic, dude.
But listen, like Chuck actually really appreciated it, and he grew into becoming the CEO of this company and having a wildly successful career and really developing a great relationship with this person. So there is this element of like balance between you have to be ready to hear feedback.
Yeah.
To really, grow in your career. And
That's so crazy. I can't get over that. This guy was like, Chuck was like, you point out my spelling mistakes, I take your job.
Yeah, it's the ultimate comeback.
That's crazy. I want to really quickly, before we go through this, like talk about, we've alluded to it, but why does your boss matter?
Yeah.
You know, why is it so important to have a good boss?
Right. The reason I'm very excited for this episode and me talking about this conversation is I think having a good boss is probably the biggest unlock you can have in your career. There's this saying that people join a company for the company, but they leave because of their boss.
Right.
And I think that's so true. You join a company because you don't actually know the people all that well when you first start, but then you start to get to know the people. And I think your boss probably has the biggest influence on how your career is going to grow at your company. It's the person you spend the most time with. It's the person that's ultimately going to decide to promote you, to pay you more, to give you more responsibility. And I think just by nature of time, it's the person you're going to become the most like. And so if you don't have a good boss, you're not going to get promoted. You're going to become probably a person that you're not proud to become, and you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities.
Yep.
On the flip side, if you have a great boss, I think your career is going to go a lot of places, and they're the person that's going to refer you to maybe a next job. You're a person who maybe they leave and you follow to your next opportunity. So I think probably the biggest impact for your career is having a great boss. And that's what I've seen in my career. How important do you think it is on your side?
I'm exactly what you said.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And something that I hadn't really thought of is the fact that you will probably pick up some of their characteristics, whether you like it or not. And that's one of the best arguments that I've heard for leaving a bad boss.
Yeah.
I think that makes a ton of sense. But I do think on the flip side, feeling supported, encouraged, advocated for in your career is like one of the most supercharging experiences. It like, from personal experience, I can say I had one boss, my last job, Emily, who, especially at the beginning when I was coming out of a toxic, not to use that word again, but like toxic situation, I was feeling like I really had to overdo it to prove myself. I was trying to burn myself out, basically. And she advocated for me, but she believed that I could do a lot, and she pushed me. So it wasn't just like, you got it, girl, you know? She was like, this was bad, and this is why it could be better, and this is why I believe that you can do it. She trusted me. She gave me opportunities that I hadn't necessarily proven myself for yet. And like, I think that was the biggest springboard for me that I could have ever possibly had.
Yeah, I think there's the quote, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you ask for. And I think in the terms of managers, your relationship with your boss, it's you don't get what you deserve, you get what someone else is going to like kind of promote you for, or like advocate on your behalf or sponsor on your behalf. And so I think having an ally as your boss inside of the organization is probably the fastest way to grow your career.
I completely agree. And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show.
All right, so we talked a lot about good bosses, and hopefully that's you. But we also know that you might not have the best boss, or you might find yourself in situations where you want to navigate a tricky situation. So we went through and highlighted 4 scenarios that you're likely to encounter. Maybe for scenario 1, hopefully you never encounter, but you're maybe likely to encounter in the workspace, and we want to give you strategies to work around these scenarios. So do you want to talk about scenario number 1, Kaila?
Yeah, let's go through it. Your boss is subtly racist, sexist, or homophobic.
Yeah, you don't want that.
No, you don't want that at all. And I think what's the most insidious part of this scenario that we created is the subtle part, because I think it's pretty easy to call out, well, that's not true, but it's easy to understand and call out that person as being outrightly racist or misogynist or sexist or whatever. When it's subtle, I feel like it's so much harder to identify confidently that it can go on for a really long time before you feel like even bringing it up. So if this is something that's happening to you, you feel like maybe you're being passed over for opportunities, higher visibility projects, maybe it's some snide comments or some like glances or something that makes you feel uncomfortable, whether it's happening towards you or towards somebody else. I think it's really insidious because it's like, okay, my boss doesn't like view me as equal to my other teammates for whatever reason. There are people that are so much smarter than both of us that have,
I don't think there's anyone
that have like more, I don't know, nuanced ways to approach this. But one thing that I do in this situation, besides like getting out of there, right? Like this one feels like the most obvious. Like if this person is racist, sexist, homophobic, any ageist, whatever, like, and it's affecting you or you're deeply uncomfortable with it, leave. Try and get out of there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, something that I do is I just act stupid. No, I'm serious. So if somebody says something that you believe is a microaggression or a dog whistle or something, just be like, oh, I'm sorry. What did you mean by that? I don't understand. And then force them to explain themselves. And yeah, it's really hard when it's a boss and you're making a boss feel uncomfortable to be like, oh, it's because I made a joke about you getting coffee because women should do those things. They're not going to actually say that, but it just like makes them a little uncomfortable and calls them out in a way that is less aggressive. But unfortunately, I don't have any like solid tips on this.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'm a white dude. Like, if anything, I probably benefited from these systems. And so I don't have great advice besides like, this is something that it seems serious and you should probably go to HR. My only feedback is like, if you're getting signs of this stuff in person with your boss, imagine what they're talking about when you're not there.
Right.
And again, like part of your career is in their hands. And if you think they have these deep biases against who you are, they're probably not going to advocate for you. And so, if you can, try to find a way out and find a boss that isn't exhibiting these behaviors.
Yeah, I completely agree. This one feels like the most cut and dry.
Yeah, bad.
Get out of there.
I feel confident going on the record. That's bad.
Yeah.
Yep.
We condemn the isms.
All right. Should we go to scenario 2?
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right, scenario 2, your boss changes their mind constantly on specific projects, goals, or deadlines.
Yeah, for me, this just sounds like it's a very frenzied boss who like doesn't have a clear vision for where they want to go, and so things are constantly getting moved around. I think my advice for something like this is communicate with your boss. And a lot of these situations, it's like you might not actually have a bad boss. They just might not be communicating in a way that's clear to you. And you should have a conversation with them being like, hey, I feel like we keep changing around what we're trying to accomplish. This is how I am interpreting a goal last week, and here's how I'm interpreting the new goal or the new strategy. Why are we doing that? Like, walk me through your thought process, because two things are going to become clear. One is, oh, I'm misinterpreting what they're saying and it's on me. Or two, yeah, this person actually does not know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And like, if they can't change, I don't want to feel frenzied. I don't want to feel rushed. And this person's likely not going to be able to help us accomplish the goals we want to accomplish.
Yep.
And then you can start looking elsewhere. But first figure out, like, maybe you're misinterpreting what they're saying, because that might be the case as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really tough situation because you are ultimately required to answer to them.
Yeah.
And if they say deadline is Thursday, actually it's this afternoon, and it's urgent and it actually does need to be done by this afternoon, you will be scrambling and it will deeply, deeply impact your day-to-day and your stress levels. I think also this can be short-term or long-term, and both have really negative effects on the team.
Yeah.
Short term, obviously, like what I just said about the deadlines, or changing the scope of a project that's short term, that's tough. But ultimately, there's an end date to that. A long term thing, for example, changing the KPIs every quarter. This is something that happened to me at a previous job where my boss's boss basically would change the structure of the entire team.
Yeah. And like what matters
And what matters, right? Every quarter, it's like they would read one book and their whole, oh, I've solved it, right? I've just figured out what we need to do in order to fix this division.
Yeah.
And the outcome was, okay, this quarter we're focusing on X as a KPI that we have to optimize for. Next quarter, this isn't working, so we're going to optimize for completely different. So we change all of our strategies. And what happens is people are like, oh, this actually doesn't matter because next quarter it's going to be something different. So I'm not going to drop everything to optimize this new thing. Instead, I'm going to give it a half-assed effort and do the rest of my other stuff.
Yeah.
Because I know that it's going to change when, they read rocks and now we're doing rocks or whatever it is. So it's really, that's a really tough one.
Yeah, I think for me, this one is about the leader just seems like they don't have confidence. And so, or they haven't done this before. So the new shiny object is the thing that they're going to go chase after. And again, if you have a boss that isn't confident, isn't competent, it is going to put a ceiling on your career. So this is probably one that you want to have a conversation with. And if you're really like, no, they don't know what they're talking about, it's time to move on.
Yeah. So I really think this one is pretty bad.
Or keep them out of bookstores at least. Don't read any more books.
Don't read any more books, please. I'm begging you for the sake of this company.
All right, let's move on to scenario 3.
Yep. Okay. Scenario 3, your boss isn't perceived as competent by the higher ups.
Yeah, this one I think is actually much more subtle, but maybe the most important thing.
Yeah.
In order for you to get promoted, sometimes your boss has to get promoted. Or in order for you to get more responsibilities, your boss or the division has to get more responsibilities. And I think it's something I probably haven't thought about before, but in preparation for this episode, I was like, oh, this is actually very important. Is if your boss isn't perceived as competent, if your boss doesn't have a good reputation inside of the company, you're unlikely to get more responsibilities, and your boss's reputation affects your reputation a little bit as well. So I think this is something that's very important to think about is my boss perceived well within the organization? If they are, stick with that person. They're going to grow and you're going to grow because of that. If they're not, you might have to do some soul searching about, is this the person I kind of want to tie my career to as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I basically don't have anything of value to add
Nailed
to that.
it.
You nailed it. But I do think that it's really tough, especially if you don't know how your boss is perceived by others, or if it's, everyone's kind of holding it close to the chest and you can't figure out that your boss isn't liked by the higher ups or isn't provided with extra responsibilities because they are viewed as incompetent.
Yeah.
I think that's what's really scary.
And the one thing I will say is this might be so important that even if they're not good at actually at their job, or there's some things you don't agree with your boss with, but they are perceived very well by their bosses or by senior leadership, I actually think that's okay.
Yeah.
You're never going to have a perfect boss, but I would say one of the things in the top I would look for or make sure they have is they're perceived well by their boss or senior leadership. That can forgive a lot of sins on the other side, because if that is the case, you're still going to get more opportunities. They're likely to grow in their career. Your division's probably not going to get shut down if they perceive your leader as competent. And so that is a really good sign, something I did not think about early in my career. And I think it's a really good strategy for all of everyone listening to think about, how is my boss perceived? And if they are perceived, that's a huge plus.
Yeah, and I think it can excuse some other bad behavior as well, because you can rocket up the chain.
You're never going to have a perfect boss unless your boss is Kayla, who's a 10 out of 10, as she said earlier.
I said a 10 out of 10 on some days. Thank you very much. All right, should we go to the final one?
Let's go to the final scenario.
All right, scenario 4. Your boss's management style is different from your own preference. This one, it's okay.
Yeah, that's probably going to happen.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about bad bosses and breaking up with your boss, obviously, scenario 1, it's very obvious. It feels pretty cut and dry. In scenario 4, it's it feels like maybe a mismatch or maybe a miscommunication. An example of this, let's kind of define what it means. The management preference is different than your own. Is maybe they have different ways of giving feedback. So, for example, maybe you prefer direct feedback, and maybe they're a little bit more subtle with how they provide their feedback. Maybe they like to be more involved in projects, get more updates more frequently, but you perceive that as micromanaging.
Yep.
They perceive that as checking in and being supportive.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily that your boss is bad. It's that your boss and you have different styles of communication, of work, maybe the extrovert versus introvert, calling back to a previous episode. And I think this is one that is solvable.
Yeah, I think the key here is your default style is unlikely to be the exact same as your boss, default. And so it just brings up the importance of actually having a conversation and sitting down with your boss and articulating, like, here's how I like to communicate. How do you like to communicate? Here's what I think is most important in this role. What do you think is most important? And if you have that conversation, you're probably going to find a sweet spot that you can operate in. But don't assume like automatically that your boss is going to communicate in a way that you like. And it is kind of on you to figure that out. And I think this particular scenario underscores the importance of being great at managing up and having a good relationship with your boss and keeping the lines of communication open.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes, probably multiple episodes, is the personal user guide.
Yes.
Which is Claire Hughes Johnson's, who is a COO of Stripe.
Yes.
Is her kind of answer to that. So she's basically one time created this document that outlines all of those things for her, and she expects her team to create those as well. This is something you create once, maybe you update when things change, and then you're able to share it with your team, your boss, and kind of tweak both your style of communication with your boss and their style of communication with you.
Yeah. And again, I think you're unlikely to have a perfect boss. So one tactic I would give to people is like, write down, stack rank what's most important to you in your boss. And one of those things might be like, we have the exact same communication style, but I would put that down at like 7. That is a solvable problem.
Yeah.
And I would say I've had bosses where initially I was like, oh man, this might not work out. We communicate differently. And then as time goes on, you're like, oh, I kind of needed to grow.
Yeah.
And like the thing I thought was great about a boss turned out not to be important. These other things about their quality of character, how great they are at their job, those matter a lot more.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I stuck with it.
Yeah.
Like anything, relationships are a function of time.
Yeah.
And so give yourself time to get to know the person, and also like make sure you know that it might be you as like hot take. Like there's some things that you think might be important that aren't actually important. And so, yeah, give yourself time and keep an open mind to grow yourself as well.
Yeah, this is one of my tactics too, which is ask yourself what you need in a good boss and then prioritize those things when you're looking for your manager.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not a bad boss, it's a bad fit. And so if you can't communicate your way out of that problem, when you're looking for your next boss, make sure that you're prioritizing the things that were deal breakers for you in the previous relationship.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is the biggest hot take is like sometimes it is your fault.
I don't think that's a hot take.
And like I think people almost are attracted sometimes to like being in a bad situation.
Yeah.
Or like a toxic situation, because we all know it gives you incredible fodder at the happy hours.
It does.
It gives you incredible fodder, but like, is that actually a situation you want to be in long term? And so I think it could be like maybe like fun for a little bit to be like, wow, my boss is doing crazy stuff. Like, isn't that hilarious? But long term, it's going to hurt your career.
Yeah.
And so having these conversations early on about what is going to work for you, super important. And then understanding there are things you can do to put yourself in a better position to have a quote unquote better boss because you're showing up in the right way. You're having these conversations that are super important. So some of this is in your control, which is good, a good thing.
I think that's a great tactic. Any other tactics to wrap it up?
I think my tactics are, the first is the personal user guide, which we had already talked about. The second is get really good at managing up and think about how you can control the relationship with your boss. And then my last one I had mentioned is give it time. I think it's so important to understand that part of having a good boss is having a good relationship with them, and relationships take time to develop. So don't expect it to go super well overnight. It's going to be something that takes some time.
Yeah, I agree. My final tactic is that if leaving is not an option, and it's not like actually illegal or very, very harmful, the onus, unfortunately, is on you to make it better. Because if you have a bad boss, the boss is not like probably like laying awake at night thinking about how they can make your life easier. It's on you, whether that's the right thing or not, to figure out how to communicate with them in a way that works for them, to figure out how to make their lives easier
Yeah.
in a way that impacts your growth. To advocate for them as well. Maybe you go do a skip level. If your boss is perceived negatively and they're not truly horrible, maybe you talk to their boss and you know,
You're like, they're actually dope. Yeah.
advocate for them, or find external mentors that maybe can fill the gaps that your manager leaves. But unfortunately, in those situations, it is on you to figure out how to make your situation better.
Yeah, and I think the through line throughout this whole episode is having a great boss is such a career hack. And if you have a bad boss, I don't think you should waste like any time either trying to solve that situation or going to find a great boss, because once you find one, you're going to unlock so much in your career. And I would say, I think even people that have a great boss, you probably don't leverage them enough.
Yeah.
Like one of the best, maybe this is another tactic, the best hacks that I've really tried to lean into in my career is when you're having a one-on-one or you're having time with your boss and they're like, you really respect them, ask them questions that aren't just about the work you're doing, but how they've navigated their career, the biggest lessons they've learned. Like you kind of have this expert that has to talk to you for 30 minutes. Like lean the F into that and come with questions that don't just have to be about like, so how do we navigate this project? Extract the knowledge that they have. Like when I was working with Chuck, I'm like, I'm talking to someone who's been a CEO of a publicly traded company for 16 years. Yeah, I'm going to get as much information out of this person as possible. And so if you have a bad boss, get out. Once you have a great boss, don't think it's going to take care of itself. Keep asking them questions, keep learning, keep growing, because it is, I think, the biggest career hack you can have.
I love that. I think it's a great way to wrap it up.
Nailed the ending. There we go. Folks, again, if you like the show and you want to be part of the show, you can send us an email at permylastemail@morningbrew.com. Don't forget to include a voice note. We're going to put your voice in the podcast. You're going to become just as famous as us. It's a pretty incredible life, folks.
Because we're so famous.
So please send us a voice note. Send us an email. With that being said, should we roll the credits?
Let's do it.
Our producer is Michaela Heck.
Our technical director is Lonnie Fiskus.
Lexi Lucas is our manager of ad operations.
And our chief content officer is Devin Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew, and thank you so much for listening.
We'll see you next week.